You think losing a 15-year marriage in a rigged court is rock bottom? You are wrong. The real cruelty is them erasing your past to hide crimes worth billions of dollars. I fled to a rotting cabin on Blackwood Lake just to hide. Then the black SUVs arrived at midnight. They wanted my worthless land, thinking I was just a broken woman. They did not realize that someone with nothing left to lose becomes the hunter. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Everly Gonzalez. I am 42 years old, and for the last 15 years, I thought I was building a legacy. Yesterday, I walked out of a downtown courthouse with absolutely nothing to my name. My ex-husband, Trent, used his expensive legal team to orchestrate a masterpiece of perjury. He framed me for systematic financial fraud, using a web of fabricated documents to strip me of the company shares I built from the ground up. In the span of 4 grueling hours, everything I had worked for was legally stolen. My reputation was in tatters, my bank accounts were frozen, and the company I poured my blood and sweat into was now entirely in Trent's manicured hands. He smiled at me from across the courtroom, a cold, predatory smile, as the judge handed down the final ruling. I was completely ruined. The only thing the court left me was a dilapidated, stilted cabin perched precariously on the muddy edge of Blackwood Lake in Missouri. It was an inheritance from my biological uncle who vanished without a trace over 20 years ago. When I dragged my single suitcase through the overgrown weeds and pushed open the warped wooden door, the sheer isolation of the place hit me like a physical blow. The cabin was dead silent, suffocating beneath the heavy, nauseating stench of damp mold, rusted iron, and rotting pine. Spiderwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling, and the floorboards groaned in protest under my weight. The air was so thick with moisture, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. This was my sanctuary now, a forgotten ruin at the edge of the earth. I spent those first few nights entirely in the dark. The local power grid had long since abandoned this stretch of the woods. I huddled beneath a thin, moth-eaten blanket, wrestling with violent panic attacks that left me gasping for air on the dusty floorboards. Every creak of the timber sounded like a threat. I was consumed by the bone-chilling sensation of being entirely discarded by the world, tossed into this watery graveyard to fade away into nothingness. I ate cold canned soup and stared into the abyss of the empty room until my eyes burned. Then on the evening of the 4th day, the storm hit. It was a torrential Missouri downpour, rattling the thin glass panes and turning the lake into a churning cauldron of black water. Around midnight, a sharp rustling noise cut through the sound of the thunder. I crept toward the entryway, my heart hammering against my ribs. A thick waterproof envelope had been shoved forcefully beneath the gap of the front door. Someone had stood out there in the freezing rain just inches away from me. My hands trembled as I tore the seal open. Inside, I found a single sheet of heavy stock paper and a cashier's check. I stared at the numbers printed on the slip, my brain struggling to process the visual information. $2 million. The typed letter was devoid of any letterhead branding or sender information. It contained a single sterile directive. Sign the enclosed deed transfer immediately and the funds are yours, the letter read. A broken, desperate woman might have wept with joy. She might have grabbed a pen, signed her soul away, and run back to civilization with a fortune. But the panic attacks suddenly stopped. The cold logic of a geological engineer kicked in, overriding my despair. I knew land. I knew soil composition, topography, and real estate valuation. This marshy, mosquito-infested sinking plot of mud and rotting wood was practically worthless on the open market. No sane developer would touch it. Therefore, this land could not possibly be worth $2 million. Unless, of course, there was something monumental being hidden right beneath my feet. I grabbed an old flashlight and pushed the front door open, stepping out into the raging storm. The rain slashed against my face as I walked down to the edge of the water, staring at the ruined, sagging docks my uncle had built decades ago. I scanned the dark surface of the lake. Then I saw it. Beneath the churning black water far below the dock, a faint light pulsed. It was the underwater buoy system my uncle had installed during his eccentric experiments. But it was not dead. It was fully operational. I watched in absolute silence as the lights blinked through the murky depths. Flash, pause, flash, flash, pause. It was a rhythmic, unbroken, and highly precise sequence. It was transmitting data. Someone was watching this land and they were willing to pay $2 million to make sure I never found out why. If you are hooked on this mystery and want to see how I turned the tables on the men who destroyed my life, please make sure to subscribe to Revenge Stories so you do not miss the next part. The morning sun did nothing to burn off the suffocating chill clinging to the lake. I was standing near the edge of the water trying to make sense of the blinking submerged lights when the low, aggressive hum of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet isolation. A polished silver luxury vehicle completely alien against the backdrop of the muddy, pothole-riddled forest road rolled to a stop just beyond the tree line. The door opened and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than what I had earned in my first 2 years as an engineer. He navigated the mud with practiced arrogance, introducing himself as a regional director for Aetheris Dynamics. I had heard the name before in industry journals, a massive energy conglomerate with deep pockets and aggressive expansion tactics. Miss Gonzalez, it is a tragedy what happened to you in the city, he began, his voice dripping with rehearsed synthetic empathy. But living out here so completely cut off from the world, it can be extremely dangerous for a woman alone. Accidents happen on these dilapidated properties all the time. Fires start. Structures collapse. People slip into the dark water and simply drown. We are offering you a remarkably generous exit strategy. For your own physical safety, I highly recommend you sign that transfer deed. It would be a terrible shame if you were to suffer another tragic loss so soon after your divorce. He smiled, but his eyes were entirely dead flat and cold, like river stones. It was not a negotiation. It was a perfectly legally phrased death threat. I forced my face to remain completely passive, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my terror. I told him to leave my property immediately. He offered one last chilling smirk, tipped his head, and walked back to his vehicle. I watched his taillights vanish into the dense pine forest, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. The moment I crossed the threshold back into the cabin, the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The heavy, damp air inside felt disturbed, as if someone had just walked through it. I stood frozen by the door, my eyes scanning the shadows of the living room. I am a woman of precise measurements. I notice when variables shift. My meager stack of canned goods on the kitchen counter had been moved exactly 1 inch to the right. The heavy wooden dining chair I had dragged against the bedroom door for security the night before was slightly angled. Someone had been inside my house while the corporate representative was keeping me distracted outside. They had not taken my laptop, my remaining cash, or my coat. It was a surgical, terrifyingly quiet intrusion. They were looking for something specific. My supposed safe haven was completely compromised. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. Pure, unadulterated panic flooded my system. I needed a weapon, anything heavy enough to swing. I remembered seeing a rusted iron crowbar resting down in the subterranean boathouse when I first inspected the property. I locked the front door quietly, unlatched the heavy floorboard hatch in the hallway, and began my descent down the damp wooden stairs into the pitch-black cellar. The smell of stagnant algae and rotting timber was overpowering. The water lapped gently against the foundational pilings just below the floor grates. I reached out into the darkness, feeling blindly along the concrete wall for the metal pipe. Instead, my hand brushed against something warm, something wearing a thick fabric coat. A figure lunged out of the absolute darkness. I screamed, swinging my fists wildly. but a heavy calloused hand clamped hard over my mouth, dragging me backward into the shadows. We crashed against the damp wall, my elbows striking solid concrete. "Do not make a single sound," a raspy voice hissed directly into my ear. The man was shaking violently. "If they hear you, if they know I am here, we are both going to die. Nod if you understand." I nodded frantically, my lungs burning for air. He released his grip slowly, stepping back and raising his hands in surrender. I scrambled backward, snatching a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench and raising it defensively. The man standing before me looked like a hunted animal. He was roughly 45 years old, his face hollowed out and covered in weeks of dirt and an unkempt beard. His clothes were stained and soaked through with lake water. But despite the desperate appearance, his eyes were sharp, calculating, and painfully terrified. "Who are you, and what are you doing under my house?" I demanded, gripping the wrench so tightly my knuckles turned white. "I am not here to hurt you," he gasped, leaning heavily against the support beam. "My name is Gideon. I have been hiding down here in the dark for 3 days. I saw the men in the black vehicles circling the woods. I saw the man in the suit today." He was not a local drifter or a thief. Gideon reached into his tattered, muddy jacket and pulled out a cracked, laminated identification badge attached to a lanyard. I aimed my small pocket flashlight at the plastic card. The bold blue logo printed at the top was identical to the pin on the lapel of the man who had just threatened me. Aetheris Dynamics. "I was their senior data analyst," Gideon explained, his breath ragged and uneven. "Until I found out what they were hiding. I barely escaped the city with my life. Now they are hunting me, and they are hunting whatever is buried under this house." I lowered the wrench slightly, my engineering brain struggling to process the colliding variables. What do they want with my uncle's land? It is just sinking mud and rotten wood. Gideon let out a bitter, humorless laugh that echoed faintly over the sound of the water. "They do not want the land, Everly. They want the blind spot. This exact geographical coordinate is the only location within a 50-mile radius where their private corporate satellite arrays cannot block or jam ground telemetry." He gestured frantically around the dark, cavernous space of the boathouse, pointing up at the massive reinforced concrete pilings that seemed entirely too thick for a simple residential cabin. "Your uncle was not just a crazy old man playing with underwater buoys. He hardwired this entire foundation deep into the bedrock. This cabin is not a house. It is a massive military-grade seismic data collection station, and it is recording everything." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a terrifying, deafening clarity. The blinking lights beneath the murky water. The $2 million check delivered in the dead of night. The veiled, smiling threats from the corporate suit. The silent intruder searching my belongings. I was not just a divorced, bankrupt woman banished to the woods to rot. I was sitting directly on top of a ticking time bomb of corporate espionage. Aetheris Dynamics knew about the station, they knew Gideon was close by, and I realized with absolute certainty that I was the next variable they needed to permanently eliminate. Fear is a heavy, paralyzing chemical response. But anger, pure distilled anger, is absolute clarity. The moment Gideon revealed the true nature of the stilted structure beneath us, the terrified, broken divorcee I had been for the past 3 years simply ceased to exist. I was an engineer again, a scientist presented with a lethal equation. We moved back up into the main living quarters. The suffocating dampness of the cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a bunker. I grabbed my flashlight and directed the beam against the rotting wooden planks of the eastern wall. If my uncle had built a subterranean data collection hub, the raw telemetry had to go somewhere. He was brilliant, but he was also notoriously paranoid. He would never trust cloud storage or digital uplinks, especially not when monitoring a corporate giant. "He hid it in the physical framework," I muttered, running my fingers along the warped pine boards. I pressed my weight against a section near the rusted fireplace. The wood groaned, but it did not give. I grabbed the heavy wrench I had taken from the cellar and drove the hooked end into the seam between the planks, prying downward with all my strength. The ancient nails shrieked as the board snapped away, revealing a hollow cavity lined with heavy-duty moisture barriers. Inside sat a series of reinforced fireproof lockboxes and thick leather-bound ledgers. Gideon stepped forward, his eyes widening as we pulled the heavy boxes onto the dusty rug. For the next 4 hours, the cabin became a war room. We spread the documents across the floorboards under the dim glow of the flashlight. Gideon had the insider knowledge of corporate operations, but I had the scientific literacy to translate the raw earth. I cracked open the first ledger. It was filled with columns of handwritten geological metrics dating back over a decade, tracking subterranean acoustic emissions, shear wave velocities, and tectonic stress patterns. "Look at these anomalies," I said, pointing to a severe spike recorded just 18 months ago. "The microseismic activity in this quadrant is completely erratic. It is not natural fault movement. Something massive is pressing down on the bedrock, altering the hydrostatic pressure." Gideon wiped the sweat from his forehead. 18 months ago. That is exactly when Aetheris Dynamics poured the main concrete foundation for the Vanguard Superdam. The Vanguard Project. It was hailed as a revolutionary triumph of modern infrastructure located a mere 5 miles upriver from Blackwood Lake. They were preparing for a massive, heavily publicized ribbon-cutting ceremony next month. I pulled out a rolled topographic map from the second lockbox and flattened it against the floor. I overlaid my uncle's subterranean telemetry coordinates onto the regional grid. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The blood drained completely from my face. "They built it on a strike-slip fault line," I whispered, my voice trembling not with fear, but with sheer, unadulterated horror. "It is a dormant fracture zone, but it is deeply unstable. The sheer tonnage of the reservoir water is acting as a wedge lubricating the fault. The underlying bedrock is fracturing." Gideon grabbed a sheaf of printed sensor readouts. "Are you saying the dam is going to fail?" "I am saying the structural failure has already begun," I replied, tapping the most recent data sets. "These acoustic spikes indicate internal shearing. The concrete core of the Vanguard Dam is cracking from the inside out. Aetheris Dynamics had to know this. Standard ground-penetrating radar would have flagged this fault line on day 1 of the preliminary surveys." "They did know," Gideon said, his voice dropping into a harsh rasp. "I saw the initial risk algorithms before they locked me out of the mainframe. The projected failure rate was catastrophic, but the government contract was worth billions of dollars. If they halted construction to relocate, they would lose the federal subsidies. So the executive board buried the authentic metrics. They falsified the environmental impact assessments and replaced them with synthetic, heavily doctored safety reports. If that dam gave way, millions of gallons of pressurized water would blast through the valley. The entire town of Blackwood, home to thousands of innocent people, would be entirely wiped off the map in less than 20 minutes. The death toll would be unfathomable. And this cabin," I said, gesturing to the floorboards beneath us, "this hardwired analog station is the only uncorrupted node left. Aetheris controls the satellites, they control the grid, but they cannot delete physical data recorded on an isolated closed-loop system. That was why they needed to buy my land so desperately. They needed to legally acquire the property so they could bring in heavy machinery and demolish the underground station, erasing the only physical proof of their impending crimes before the grand opening." I reached back into the wall cavity, my hand brushing against a smaller secondary lockbox tucked far into the corner. I pulled it out and pried the lid open. Inside were not geological logs, but thick stacks of financial records, bank statements, and printed emails. My uncle had not just been monitoring the earth, he had been following the money. I began sifting through the papers, tracing a labyrinth of offshore shell companies and hidden wire transfers funded by Aetheris Dynamics. Then I stopped. My breath hitched in my throat. Sitting in the middle of the pile was a printed banking ledger from a private wealth management firm. My eyes locked onto the beneficiary name, Trent and Associates. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. I stared at the dates of the massive 6-figure deposits flowing from Aethirus subsidiaries directly into my ex-husband's private accounts. The first payment was initiated precisely 3 years ago. The exact same month, Trent suddenly began pushing for aggressive expansion in our engineering firm. The second deposit aligned perfectly with the week I was accused of financial fraud. The final largest transfer occurred just 2 days before the judge finalized our divorce and awarded me this specific worthless piece of land. The jigsaw puzzle of my ruined life snapped together, revealing a picture so grotesque it made my stomach heave. My failure was not a natural disaster. My divorce was not the tragic collapse of a 15-year marriage. It was a hostile corporate takeover. Trent had been bought. Aethirus Dynamics identified the legal loophole. The land belonged to me, but if I was financially secure, I would never sell it. So they hired my husband to destroy me. Trent orchestrated the perjury, stripped my assets, ruined my reputation, and manipulated the court into isolating me in this godforsaken cabin. I was supposed to be so broken, so destitute, and so desperate that I would blindly sign away the deed for a fraction of its worth, entirely unaware that I was handing over the only evidence that could stop a massacre. Every sleepless night, every tear, every panic attack over the past 3 years had been meticulously engineered by men in tailored suits sitting in a glass boardroom. They had played me for a fool. They thought they had successfully discarded a helpless middle-aged woman into the dirt. I slowly folded the bank ledger and placed it into my pocket. The crushing weight of grief and victimhood evaporated, burning away in an instant. What replaced it was a cold, calculated, and terrifyingly focused wrath. I looked at Gideon, my jaw set like stone. We were no longer hiding. We were going to war. The siege began exactly 2 days after we unearthed the truth. Aethirus Dynamics had clearly lost their patience with the subtle approach. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the suffocating stench of burning rubber and gasoline. I rushed to the window and watched massive flames engulf my old battered sedan parked near the tree line. The fire roared, illuminating the dark woods in a violent, mocking orange glow. By the time the sun rose, the vehicle was nothing but a scorched, hollowed-out metal skeleton. I checked the landline. Dead. I walked down the muddy access road and found 3 massive pine trees deliberately felled across the only exit route, their trunks thick enough to stop a bulldozer. They were systematically sealing me inside a cage. By noon, the real psychological warfare arrived. A sleek black luxury SUV navigated the uneven terrain, coming to a halt just shy of the burnt wreckage of my car. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out into the damp Missouri air. It was Trent. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit, looking impeccably groomed, entirely out of place against the backdrop of my rotting cabin and the smoldering ash of my only escape vehicle. Seeing the man who had orchestrated the absolute destruction of my life standing in my driveway sent a surge of pure venomous adrenaline straight into my bloodstream. My hand twitched, desperate to grab the heavy iron wrench resting on the porch railing and smash it directly into his arrogant, smiling face. "Everly," Trent said, sighing deeply as he approached the porch. His voice dripped with that familiar patronizing warmth he always used when he thought I was being irrational. "Look at how you are living. Look at this place. I told you that you were making a mistake isolating yourself out here. It is dangerous. The local police think kids from town vandalized your car, but we both know you cannot stay here now." He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at me with synthetic pity. "I am here as a neutral party," he continued, holding up his hands. "The buyers reached out to my firm. They are still willing to honor the $2 million offer. I know you hate me right now, but I am begging you to be smart. Take the money, sign the deed, and walk away. Keep your life. Do not die over a stubborn attachment to a pile of rotten wood." It took every ounce of psychological endurance I possessed not to spit the truth directly at him. I knew about the offshore accounts. I knew about the bribes. I knew he was the architect of my ruin. But screaming at him would gain me nothing. Rage without strategy is just a tantrum. I needed him comfortable. I needed him entirely convinced of his own superior intellect. So I broke. I let my shoulders slump. I manufactured a tremor in my hands and let my voice crack with perfectly calibrated desperation. I have nowhere else to go, Trent, I whispered, staring at my worn shoes. I am terrified. I just want it to end. But my uncle's things are still in the walls. His journals, his research. It is the only family history I have left. Just give me 24 hours to pack his belongings and clear out the house. Then I will sign whatever you want. Trent's eyes gleamed with the unmistakable thrill of victory. He had broken the difficult woman. He had won. 24 hours. Trent agreed, his tone magnanimous and soft. I will handle the buyers. I will see you tomorrow, Everly. He turned and walked back to his vehicle, his posture radiating arrogant triumph. I stood on the porch, trembling, watching his car disappear down the road. The moment he was out of sight, the facade vanished. My posture straightened, and the manufactured tears dried instantly. I turned and walked back inside where Gideon was waiting in the shadows. The clock is ticking, I said, my voice cold and steady. We have 24 hours to build a bomb. We did not mean a literal explosive. We meant an informational one. We knew perfectly well that we could not simply walk into the local police station with a box of evidence. Aetheris Dynamics owned this county. The sheriff, the local judges, the municipal zoning boards, they were all feeding from the same corporate trough. If we handed over the physical ledgers, the documents would conveniently vanish in an evidence room fire, and Gideon and I would be found floating face down in Blackwood Lake. The evidence had to bypass the local authorities entirely. It had to be undeniable, public, and viral. We spent the next 12 hours tearing apart the scorched remains of my car. We salvaged the intact alternator sections of the copper wiring harness and the heavy-duty battery. We hauled the parts down into the subterranean boathouse, integrating them directly into my uncle's massive analog seismic arrays. Gideon used his intimate knowledge of the Aetheris data architecture, while I handled the physical engineering and power routing. Together, we converted the passive data collection station into a high-frequency broadband encrypted radio transmitter. We were going to force the Earth itself to testify. By hour 18, the jury-rigged console hummed to life, drawing a massive surge of power from the underwater turbines my uncle had built decades ago. We had a direct, untraceable uplink. I sat down at the terminal. I did not want to deal with regional directors or proxy lawyers anymore. I wanted the architect of the Vanguard Superdam. Using Gideon's old security clearance codes, I bypassed the corporate firewall and routed a direct encrypted text message to the personal device of Julian, the Chief Executive Officer of Aetheris Dynamics. The message was brief and devoid of emotion. I know about the fault line beneath Vanguard. I have the physical black box containing 10 years of uncorrupted seismic telemetry. Come to the cabin in person tomorrow to sign the transfer deed, or the data goes to the Federal Oversight Committee at noon. Do not send proxies. I hit send, leaning back in the chair as the screen went dark. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for the monsters to walk through the front door. The rain returned just before noon, a steady rhythmic drumming against the corrugated tin roof of the cabin. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling in the center of the warped wooden floor. I was standing by the small camping stove, waiting for the water to boil, when the low growl of heavy engines vibrated through the floorboards. 3 massive armored sport utility vehicles tore through the mud of the access road, parking aggressively in a semicircle around the front porch. The doors opened simultaneously. 4 men stepped out first, their postures rigid, their eyes scanning the tree line. They were private security ex-military contractors, wearing tactical gear beneath dark raincoats, their hands resting casually near the concealed holsters at their waists. Then Trent emerged. He looked nervous today, his usual arrogance tempered by the sheer physical presence of the man who stepped out of the lead vehicle. Julian, the Chief Executive Officer of Aetheris Dynamics, did not look like a corporate bureaucrat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned everything he looked at. He wore a bespoke charcoal overcoat that repelled the rain entirely. He looked at my rotting cabin with profound, undisguised disgust. They did not bother to knock. The front door was shoved open, and Julian stepped into the dim, damp living room, flanked by two of his armed guards and my ex-husband. The guards immediately fanned out, securing the perimeter of the small room. "Miss Gonzalez," Julian said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute authority. "I received your theatrical message. I must admit I am surprised. I was told you were entirely broken. Yet here you are attempting to extort a multi-billion-dollar energy conglomerate." I did not look at him right away. I calmly poured the boiling water over the cheap coffee grounds in my cracked ceramic mug. The smell of bitter roasted beans filled the stagnant air. "Would anyone like a cup?" I asked, my voice completely flat and devoid of any tremor. "The roof leaks, but the water is hot." Julian sneered, stepping further into the room. His expensive leather shoes squelched against the waterlogged floorboards. "Drop the act. We do not have time for this rural hospitality nonsense. Trent tells me you are ready to sign the deed. You also claim to have a physical data drive containing a decade of seismic telemetry. I want it on this table right now." He snapped his fingers. One of the guards stepped forward and slammed a heavy titanium briefcase onto my rotting dining table. The guard popped the latches and flipped it open. Inside were stacks of crisp, banded $100 bills. $2 million, Julian stated. His eyes locked onto mine. "Cash, untraceable. It is enough money for you to disappear to a tropical island and forget you ever heard the name Aetheris Dynamics. But if you try to negotiate, or if you are lying about having that black box, my men will burn this cabin to the ash with you inside it." Trent stepped forward, wiping rain from his forehead. He looked at me with that familiar, sickeningly sweet expression of false concern. "Everly, please. Just take the money. You fought hard, but it is over. You cannot win against these people. I told Julian you were smart enough to see reason. Hand over your uncle's record, sign the paper, and you can finally start over." I took a slow sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter liquid burn the back of my throat. I set the mug down and looked directly at the man I had been married to for 15 years. "Start over," I asked quietly. "How much did it cost Trent? How much did it cost to buy 15 years of marriage, to fabricate those financial fraud charges and perjure yourself in federal court?" Trent stiffened his eyes, darting nervously toward Julian. But Julian simply laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound. "Oh, let us not be coy," Julian interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "She knows Trent. She is an engineer, not an idiot. I paid your husband $500,000 to orchestrate your divorce and strip your assets. It was the cleanest, most legally sound way to force this property into a distress sale. We needed this land, and you were too financially secure to sell it. So we made you destitute. It was nothing personal, Miss Gonzalez. It was simply a line item in our quarterly acquisition budget." "And the Vanguard Superdam?" I asked, turning my gaze to the CEO. "What is the line item for the thousands of people who will drown when the concrete core fractures?" Julian's smile vanished. His jaw tightened, and the predatory mask slipped back into place. "The dam is perfectly fine. The microfractures in the strike-slip fault are manageable. We will inject resin into the bedrock next year once the federal subsidies clear." The environmental impact reports were adjusted for the greater good of national energy independence. Now I am losing my patience. "Where is the black box?" "You admit it, then," I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through the sound of the rain. "You admit that Aetheris Dynamics knowingly falsified structural integrity reports, bribed a civilian to commit perjury, and built a Class 1 hydroelectric facility on an actively shearing tectonic fault line." "I admit that I run the world and you live in a swamp," Julian snarled, stepping into my personal space. "Last chance, Everly. Where is the data?" I reached under the table and pulled up a heavy rusted iron lockbox. I placed it gently next to the briefcase of money. Julian's eyes gleamed with greedy anticipation. He reached out to grab it, but I rested my hand on the lid. "You came all this way for the black box," I said, maintaining absolute eye contact. "But you misunderstood the engineering of this cabin, Julian. My uncle did not just build a storage drive. He built a closed-loop acoustic array. He recorded sound. I flipped the latch and pushed the lid open. Julian leaned forward, expecting to see stacks of ledgers or a hardened hard drive. Instead, the box was entirely empty save for a thick bundle of copper wires connected to a high-frequency, professional-grade studio microphone. The microphone was bolted to the bottom of the box. Near the base of the metal stand, a small, bright red light pulsed steadily in rhythm with a digital timer. Julian stared at the red light. His brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this? Where are the files?" "The files are not here," I said, taking a deliberate step backward. "They are currently being projected onto a 60-foot digital screen in Washington." Trent blinked, his face suddenly draining of all color. "What are you talking about?" "Today is the opening keynote of the National Energy Conference," I explained, my voice echoing with icy precision. "There are currently over 5,000 people sitting in the main auditorium. Federal regulators, investigative journalists, senators, and the entire board of directors for Aethirus Dynamics. 20 minutes ago, my associate hacked into the main audiovisual feed of the convention center using a broadband transmitter wired directly into the bedrock below us." Julian's breathing stopped. The room went dead silent. "They are not just looking at the raw seismic telemetry proving the Vanguard Dam is collapsing." I continued gesturing to the microphone in the box. "They have been listening to this live audio feed for the last 10 minutes. They heard you offer me a $2 million cash bribe. They heard you admit to falsifying the federal environmental impact reports. And they heard you confess to paying Trent $500,000 to commit perjury." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. I watched the realization hit Julian like a physical blow to the chest. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His eyes widened as the sheer magnitude of the trap snapped shut around him. He was a man who operated in the shadows, using money and influence to crush his enemies silently. I had just dragged him into the blinding, unforgiving light of a national stage. "Kill the feed." Julian roared, his composure shattering entirely. He spun toward his lead guard's spit, flying from his lips. "Shoot the microphone! Shoot her!" The lead guard's hand blurred toward his waistband, his fingers gripping the handle of his tactical pistol. Before the weapon could clear the holster, I stomped my heel hard against a specific floorboard near the kitchen counter. Deep beneath the cabin in the flooded cellar, Gideon slammed his hand down on the master override switch of my uncle's antiquated security system. Pneumatic pistons dormant for 2 decades, fired with a deafening metallic shriek. Massive 1/4-inch thick steel blast shutters slammed down over the windows and the front door, simultaneously sealing the cabin in absolute darkness. The lock mechanisms engaged with a heavy final clanking sound. The sudden darkness was instantly pierced by the pulsing red light of the live microphone and a barrage of emergency strobe lights flashing from the ceiling. Then the siren began. It was not a modern alarm. It was an old Cold War-era air raid siren, mounted on the roof of the cabin, powered directly by the underwater turbines. It wailed with a bone-rattling, ear-splitting frequency that vibrated through the floorboards and echoed across the entire expanse of Blackwood Lake. It was loud enough to wake every single resident in the neighboring town 5 miles away. Julian's guards drew their weapons, sweeping the dark, sealed room with their mounted flashlights, but there was nowhere to go. The steel shutters were rated to withstand a bomb blast. We were locked in a vault. Suddenly, the harsh electronic buzzing of a cellular phone cut through the momentary lulls in the siren. It was Julian's private satellite phone, vibrating violently in his chest pocket. He pulled it out with trembling hands. The screen illuminated his terrified face. The caller ID displayed the name of the chairman of the Aethirus Board of Directors. A second later, Trent's phone began to ring. Then the guards' phones. The cacophony of ringing devices filled the sealed room, a chorus of absolute doom. The outside world was calling, and they were not calling to negotiate. The FBI, the regulators, the shareholders, they were all watching the live feed. Trent collapsed to his knees, clutching his ringing phone, sobbing uncontrollably into his hands. The arrogant mastermind who had ruined my life was now just a pathetic broken man crying in the dark. Julian stared at his ringing phone, his chest heaving with panic. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and wild, like a trapped animal staring at the hunter. He finally understood. He had walked into the wilderness expecting to slaughter a defenseless sheep only to realize he had locked himself inside a cage with a wolf. The security contractors did not even have time to fetch their breaching tools. My calculation was exact to the minute. The deafening wail of the air raid siren was soon overpowered by the heavy rhythmic thumping of twin rotor blades descending from the storm clouds. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had deployed tactical units via helicopter directly from the Capitol. The heavy steel shutters of my cabin were forced open from the outside, flooding the room with the harsh glare of tactical floodlights. Federal agents swarmed the living room, stripping the weapons from Julian's men and forcing the CEO to the waterlogged floor. Within 2 hours, the Vanguard project was indefinitely suspended under emergency federal orders. By the time the sun rose, the corporate stock of Aetherius Dynamics had completely collapsed, plummeting to worthless fractions of a penny. They dragged Julian and Trent out into the muddy clearing just as the morning light broke. The blaring siren had drawn dozens of Blackwood residents out of the woods, and they stood in the freezing mud watching the untouchable corporate elites being paraded in heavy iron handcuffs. As the agents shoved Trent toward the back of an armored transport, he dug his heels into the dirt and turned back to look at me. His designer suit was ruined, plastered with mud and rainwater. "Everly, please," Trent begged, his voice cracking hysterically. "Tell them I was just a consultant. Tell them I did not know about the dam. I am your husband. Please help me." I stood on the porch looking down at the man who had systematically dismantled my life. I felt absolutely no anger anymore. Only a profound, chilling pity. He was finally experiencing the exact devastation he had designed for me, but his ruin was broadcast to the entire nation. I turned my back and walked inside without uttering a single word. 6 months later, I did not return to the glittering high society of the city. The state preserved the rotting, stilted cabin as a historical whistleblower monument. The federal courts awarded me a massive settlement from the corporate liquidation fund. I took that fortune and built an independent engineering oversight firm dedicated exclusively to tearing down corrupt infrastructure projects funded by untouchable oligarchs. Gideon took the corner office as my lead technical partner. I stood on the polished teak deck of my brand-new research vessel, anchored perfectly in the center of the calm, silent waters of Blackwood Lake. I took a slow sip of dry red wine, letting the cool evening breeze wash over my face. I realized then that the biased judge had not destroyed me on that terrible day in court. By stripping away the illusions of my past, they had liberated me. They cut the parasites from my life and left me with nothing but the raw materials to forge an empire that no powerful man could ever steal from me again. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.